Good morning, Chris, and thank you very much for giving the Mint some of your time.
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, I think it's nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Brilliant. Well, I thought it would be useful to start by giving you an opportunity to set out why you think low energy agricultural food systems are the sort of future, rather than the sort of techno direction of sort of precision fermentation, alt proteins, etc.
Right. Well, obviously, it's always difficult talking about the future, isn't it? Because we don't know what's going to happen. But
Yeah.
I mean, I think we have sort of long been on this global path towards a high energy, kind of highly disparately interconnected global system, which involves a great degree of urbanism, a great degree of sort of flow in the system of consumerism and so on, and that's led to a whole bunch of problems. I mean, climate change obviously looms large, but questions about energy futures, questions about poverty and hunger, geopolitical conflict, and so I guess I have engaged in a kind of argument really with the techno fix mindset that all of these problems are soluble sort of within the structure of that system, usually through technological means, so low carbon energy production, or kind of new food technologies, and so on. And I mean, one aspect of this is that an appealing future? Is that do those sort of fixes and patches to this huge sprawling global system that we've created, does that actually create lives for the majority of people that people actually want? But also, is it feasible? Does it do those kind of piecemeal fixes and patches to that existing system, do they stack up? Are they going to work? So I suppose quite a lot of my writing has been suggesting, well, no, they're not going to work. If they do work, then we get into the question of what kind of world does that create? Is that an appealing world? And I'm not sure the answer to that is in the affirmative either. So yeah, so that's how I sort of navigate that kind of terrain.
And the alternative future that you suggest is, I mean, can you give some sort of idea of how that might look?
Well, I think the way it looks is if we're talking agriculture, it's a more peopled, smaller scale, more ecological agriculture that is more geared to local needs. I mean, one of the problems we've got into in global agriculture is that producers are part of essentially global markets, which is a function of cheap energy, basically. So, if I'm producing my vegetables here in Somerset and trying to sell them locally, I'm basically competing with whoever in the world can grow similar vegetables at a cheaper price. And the result of that is that it tends to force specialization, a sort of comparative advantage kind of idea in terms of the handful of agricultural commodities that can be produced most advantageously in a given place, and it tends to push you into high energy, typically high fossil energy, low labor input forms of agriculture. So I sort of think we need to flip that. Rather than thinking in terms of producing the cheapest commodities, we need to be producing the food and other goods and services that we need more locally. That obviously sort of has enormous knock-on implications for the way that we organize ourselves, and I don't really see a kind of obvious mechanism to deliver that in terms of existing mainstream politics. So part of my writing has coming crisis. You know, I think this is going to emerge out of crisis and sort of supply chain disruptions of one kind and another. But I mean, it's interesting, your question, can I give you a picture? Because partly I can't, because there are so many kind of feedback loops and knock-on implications. It's hard to do that. The other thing, the other reason I'm slightly resistant to it is that it's very easy to create you know, what people often dismiss as a sort of romanticized vision of you know, sort of happy peasants sort of at the harvest. And you know, I do think that most parts of the world have developed good, ecologically sensitive, mixed local agricultures historically that we can learn from. You know, it kind of bugs me that, you know, whenever we start looking at local traditions in the past, you know, except perhaps in the context of post-colonial indigenous agricultures, we tend to be very dismissive and say, oh well, we can't go back. You know, it's not really about going back to the past, but it's about learning from people who've who've developed ecologically sensitive, low impact agricultures. So yeah, you know, I don't want to paint this as a kind of rose garden. You know, I think it's going to emerge in sort of circumstances of difficult crisis, and yet we know that people can come together, people do innovate agricultural and local economic systems. You know, we've learned a lot from the history of commons and you know, various forms of sort of household and political organization. So I think that's what we need to bring to the table in this debate, rather than just assuming kind of business as usual. You know, we can solve this with sort of high energy techno fixes.
But I suppose if we take the commons, yes, there have been commons, but also, of course, history with the enclosures and stuff has shown how more powerful players will grab hold of things if they can. And I suppose during this crisis or ongoing crisis or series of crises, etc., as the existing structures break down, presumably the powerful people who are losing will seek to cover their losses, or you know, or try to get to a position that which keeps their status, because everyone avoids loss, don't they? So there is a sort of risk, I suppose, that they will try and, you know, we already have huge disparities in land ownership anyway, don't we? So
yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you've put your finger on. I mean, this is going to be the exact issue that is going to shake out eventually. And you know, you're right that essentially sort of entrepreneurs of political power, or even entrepreneurs of violence, you know, they do. It is possible for them to capture more local systems. I mean, that's kind of how we've got to where we are in the world now. I mean, I think it's interesting that we've sort of had this very long period of globalization, you know, sort of Immanuel Wallerstein's world system theory sort of thing. And I think, you know, that I think it will break down in various ways, and we're going to get various forms of relocalization. And certainly it's never been part of my narrative to say that's, you know, that's all going to be easy and breezy. I think, you know, that is exactly going to be the issue, the extent to which, if you like, ordinary people can come together and sort of innovate their way out of the crisis by developing better local systems, and the extent to which they will be frustrated or co-opted by wider forces. And you know, we tend to, I suppose we have a kind of view of the state in sort of modern welfare, sort of welfare capitalism, or sort of state bureaucracy, as being essentially this benevolent force which is mediating different stakeholders. Obviously, you know, throughout most of history, the ordinary people have not necessarily thought of the state, or you know, the monarchy or the empire as being a benevolent force, and I think it may not be again in the future. So that is exactly what's at stake. You know, how that shakes out in terms of you know, a whole panoply of different political forces, which is kind of interesting historically in the sense that, you know, we've got this in some ways rather simplified global system of nation states, you know, obviously some of them much more powerful than others, but, you know, it's sort of the same political model worldwide, where, you know, whereas if you go back to pre-modern times, you have a, you know, a whole panoply of different kinds of political actors making potentially different kinds of claims over the same territory. And I think we may be in that situation again in the future. You know, people talk about a new medievalism, you know, in that context. So, you know, interesting times.
Well, one sort of element to this, of course, is that ordinary people in the countryside are themselves quite diverse, aren't they, in their backgrounds? I mean, I live near Oxford in a small village, and it's sort of noticeable that, if you like, there are sort of different tribes, or people belong in the village belong to different tribes and different backgrounds. There's people obviously who you know, have lived there for a long time. We can trace, you know, their land and small bits of land quite often, but and they all went to the same schools and local schools, etc. And then there are quite a lot of different types of incomers, and then there's the sort of landed landed aristocracy sort of elements as well. So there's an interesting challenge there: is, are these people going to work together, or are they actually going to break apart?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I've just been writing a little bit about this. I mean, and you know, obviously, I don't have the answers, and the answers are going to be different in different places. But that, yeah, I mean, that's sort of the issue. I mean, I think we need, you know, a lot of parts of the world there's very concentrated land ownership, and that can, you know, there are different kind of histories behind that. But yeah, the question is whether you get a kind of landlord's society where the existing large landowners manage to retain control and sort of, you know, I think we're moving to a situation where land ownership is going to be, or you know, access to the productivity of the land is going to be more important politically and economically than it has been in recent times. You know, I mean, a country like Britain, I mean, we, you know, we don't tend to think that much about food and agriculture, and you know, the real kind of economic impetus is urban and industrial and so on. But you know, I think that's going to change, and in the process of changing, sort of who has access to land is going to become a very much more important question, and the issue is, you know, will that get unlocked? And you know, it's sort of interesting, exactly as you frame it. You know, there are sort of existing large scale sort of aristocratic landowners, if you like, and more, you know, large scale commercial farmers. There are sort of local working class people, if you like, who are well grounded in the area, who might have access to land. There are incomers who might bring sort of money to the table. And I think exactly how the relationships between those kind of players works out is going to be very consequential for the kinds of society that we get, and it's, you know, it's going to be varied, I think, yeah, it's kind of hard to think through all the implications, but that's kind of what I think we should be doing, and we're kind of not within our mainstream political narratives.
I suppose one thing we've lost over the relative recent past is traditional mixed farming, haven't we? So,
Right.
I mean, it's interesting here in Oxford where there's a project to try and create relationships between the colleges and local growers and farmers, and sort of create local food systems. But of course, a lot of the farmers just sell into large commodity markets. And for instance, can't, you know, have no skills or experience of growing fruit and veg, for instance, and so on. So I suppose if there's could be some interesting dynamics if these large commodity markets begin to break down, if you like, and then these farmers don't have markets or loose markets, international markets, and so on, how they're then able to actually move to grow something that can be done locally, and whether they actually need people who have the right skills, which might sort of change change power dynamics some.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing you mentioned there, which I think is a big problem, is horticultural skills. You know, fruit and veg growing, because it's a labour-intensive form of food production. We have tended to kind of export the need for it, or put that another way, we've tended to import fruit and veg, or import people with skills in it, and you know, we've really lost that in contemporary Britain, and you know, throughout the wealthy countries. And you know, I think we urgently need to regain those skills. I mean, I think what is happening with larger scale farmers, you know, there's big issues with farm succession, a lot of disillusionment about the economic returns to mainstream farming. So farmers are often quite interested in having people coming onto their farms, you know, stacking enterprises, having somebody, you know, growing fruit and veg on a few acres. And you know, I think those are quite positive, you know, because ultimately, I think commercial farmers, you know, they end up being in charge of quite large areas of land, but you know, with a sort of commercial mindset, which is going to be changing. It that's all in this mix as well. And obviously, you know, they don't necessarily have a lot of labor. It's a very mechanized, you know, we tend to basically produce a lot of cereals, and you know, I suppose it's the sort of traditional English farming is basically wheat and beef, you know, unless you're forced into something else, you know. But we are going to be forced into something else, I think. And so I think the kind of decisions that those sorts of farmers make is, you know, are going to be important. And obviously the extent to which people coming in can actually leverage, you know, it's not just kind of paying rent and sort of paying your respects to the landowner, but actually being a little bit more politically spiky, that you know, we potentially get into some, you know, real conflicts, as there have been globally and in this country over the years, over, you know, who has rights and access to land. You know, that's going to come back into the equation.
And I suppose if you throw into the situation that there are going to be lots of urban dwellers who maybe are looking for somewhere to go, presuming in these situations there will be a depopulation of cities, and
yes,
be moving to the country to survive.
Yeah, I mean, I get into trouble with this argument. It sort of it kind of cuts against our sort of very cherished modern notions of urbanism and urbanization. But yeah, I mean, you know, basically people go, people seek peace and prosperity, I guess, and you know, the narrative of recent centuries in richer countries, and more recently in poorer countries, is that, you know, prosperity is essentially urban. Or I mean, that's not really true. You know, people stitch together quite complicated sort of hybrid urban rural lifestyles, but you know, there is this narrative that everyone's moving to the cities, and you know, there's a grain of truth in that, and there are reasons for that, but there's also a counter truth that people do want to farm, and increasingly will be doing that. I think they will be being drawn back into the countryside, because prosperity in cities and peace will become harder. So yeah, I think there is going to be, in the long term, there's going to be a net population movement, I think, away from cities and towards the areas that are most agriculturally productive. And you know, there is potential for a lot of conflict around that, which is partly why I'm, you know, I guess I'm trying to raise my voice and say, you know, we need to be thinking about this issue, because you know, ideally we want it to sort of happen in as orderly and full away as possible, you know.
So are there any sort of, I mean, I wonder whether we can look at, say, the experience of the USSR in the 90s, sort of post breakdown, etc., and whether there's anything we can sort of see there as potentially giving some sort of idea of how things might happen here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know an awful lot about the USSR. I mean, I have seen stuff about kind of small holdings and small gardens. Basically when the economy tanked, a lot of people are basically suddenly have to start producing more of their own livelihood and sort of innovating local livelihoods. And actually, small, there was a tradition of gardening and small allotments and small holdings that was quite consequential in that period for a lot of people putting through. And you kind of a lot of historical situations of crisis and breakdown, you actually get that sort of return to the land. I mean, one of my favorite photos I've ever seen is the Reichstag in Berlin just after the end of World War II, and the Reichstag is sort of in ruins, and in front of it there's people with sort of wheelbarrows and spades and things, and it's this very graphic sort of when all these dreams of imperial hegemony and grandiosity come crumbling down. What's left? Well, the land and people's labor, and the need and the ability to sort of produce as best you can locally. So yeah, there's and likewise with the whole sort of urbanization. I mean, people talk about sort of livelihoods and urban rural livelihoods. There is a kind of hidden counter movement to the land, or an existing sort of land-based livelihoods that people are making globally, particularly in lower income countries, that are very important as a sort of livelihood strategy, that it is supplemented obviously with wage labor, in the city or abroad. But as those larger economic possibilities break down, that's going to put more pressure on the land. So, as I say, that's what I think we need to be preparing for.
And I suppose that in the UK, there's also like incredible edibles. And have you seen any others? Do you think there is a growing awareness maybe of the need to grow your own?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of initiatives and organisations, and I think people getting more interested in sort of home gardens and allotments and so on, and a lot more young people now who are interested in farming and food production. I think it is. It's a little bit hampered by the economics of land ownership, or the way that it's hard to make these sort of things work commercially in the present economic climate. But I think part of the problem is the disconnect, the alienation. Most people don't really know anything about food and farming, so the fact that there are just these initiatives and people starting to re-embrace it, I think is a good sign. But I don't think it's gone far enough or fast enough. But yeah, things like incredible edible, I think it's good for it to be sometimes people can be a bit idealistic, or you can get sort of collective community gardening initiatives, for example, which can be a bit naive about the nature of the relation, to put a lot of loading on one or two pioneering volunteers. So part of this, I think, is about learning. I mean, we've done this over the years on our land, sort of try to figure out relationships that work and don't work. So part of it is about learning the nuts and bolts of farming and gardening, but also the nuts and bolts of the social arrangements that work and don't work. So yeah, so there's good things happening for sure.
Yeah, no, it's sort of, I think that's really interesting. We're trying to set up a community garden on one of the villagers' land, and it's going to be, I think, quite interesting, because of course everyone's working very hard. How much time are they going to put into it? How do you share the surplus? How do you and maybe we need more of these sorts of experiments.
Yes, I think we do, but that's where, again, I think it's useful to look at past societies, where people, or present societies where people are actually heavily dependent on on their own production to you know, to keep themselves fed and healthy, because you know, I suppose one of my shticks is that we can be a little bit over romantic about commons. I mean, there's a lot of transaction costs involved in commons. You know, you have to sort of figure out, you know, how you're going to get on with everybody else, or you know, exactly as you were just saying, how do we share the harvest, who's putting the work in, who's and you know, there's a kind of mental load aspect to it as well. It's like, you know, who's going to check that the plants are properly watered, or the the cows are milked or whatever, and you know, historically very often those sorts of activities get localized in the household because of, you know, the transaction costs and the emotional load of otherwise arranging it. But you get very complicated sort of mixed systems of commoning versus household production that, you know, that people figure out over time. So, you know, I don't think we should be reinventing the wheel. You know, we can learn from other societies about how they've done that and apply that ourselves.
Well, it's interesting that actually the people whose land, one of the people who own it is from rural India.
Right.
And one of the things he said was, of course, in rural India, everyone depends on everyone else.
Yeah.
You know, you don't have all those services, all that sort of structure. So fundamental society is the need to get on and work together and so forth, because, you know, if things go bad in any way, you depend on your neighbour.
Yeah. And it's interesting, I suppose, in terms of the previous segment of our conversation. I mean, I think that a positive way that could go is that, you know, somebody owns the land. You know, we've got this vast sort of amount of capital flowing around the world that tends to, you know, a lot of it tends to congeal in land values that sort of basically makes land way more costly than anything you can do by actually producing food on it. But as you say, ultimately, we are dependent on each other. We're dependent on food and material necessities. So you can imagine a situation in which, you know, somebody historically has bought land or owned land and has all this congealed capital in it that ultimately doesn't really mean anything very much in a more localized society. What matters in that latter eventuality is the relationships, is the skills, you know, is the local politics, and that's where hopefully you know, people can to some degree come together and make those sort of things work, even if, you know, some of it is, as I was saying, I think is going to be about you know, people having their own household's garden, but that's going to be set within the context of a wider community.
Brilliant. Well, that I think it's a great point to end, and I'm sure we will be talking again about this in the future. But it's been fascinating, and thanks very much, Chris, for participating.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. It's a pleasure talking with you.
Brilliant.